Hello and welcome everybody. I'm Erica Evans and I'm a reporter with the Deseret News in-depth team. I'm excited to moderate this Deseret News panel discussion on the burdens women have disproportionately borne during the pandemic. As COVID-19 continues to be the cause of widespread unemployment, women have been most affected. Women are being forced out of the workforce at such a rate, it's been dubbed a she-session by the president of the Institute for Women's Policy Research, C. Nicole Mason. And today, the labor participation rate of mothers is back to what it was in the 1980s. So we decided to host this panel discussion based on recent pieces in the Deseret News by Art Raymond and Savannah Hopkinson. Today, we are addressing why women have suffered more job losses than men, and we will examine how policy supports women's roles as providers and parents. So we're thrilled to have these distinguished panelists with us today. First, we have Reshma Saujani from New York City, founder and CEO of Girls Who Code, an international nonprofit working to close the gender gap in the technology sector. And she's also a sponsor of the Marshall Plan for Moms, a plan to pay mothers for their unseen unpaid labor. Next, we have Dr. Susan R. Madsen joining us from Bountiful, Utah. She's an author, scholar, and founder of the Utah Women and Leadership Project, which aims to strengthen the impact of the state's girls and women through research, resources, and training events. We also want to welcome Dr. Sarah Jane Glynn from Nashville. She's an expert in work-family policies, gender wage inequality, and family economic security. She is a senior fellow and director of women's economic policy at the Center for American Progress, a public policy research and advocacy organization. From our end, we have Art Raymond, who is an award-winning business reporter for the Deseret News. He has extensively covered Utah's tech sector and the effects of the pandemic on employment. We also have Savannah Hopkinson, a writer for the Deseret News opinion team, who frequently writes about family policy and has won awards for her news reporting and columns. And we should also note she's a new mom, because we're going to talk about what an accomplishment that is and how it's probably something you should be able to put on your resume. So we'll start with Art and Savannah. You both had pieces that went in depth on COVID-19 unemployment disparities. Art, can you start by telling us about the genesis of your article, Moms Are Bearing the Brunt of U.S. COVID-19 Job Losses?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to say thanks to everybody who's participating. It's really fun to see this conversation elevated. And it's one I think is definitely worthy of an elevated conversation and exploration. I'm looking forward to being able to engage in this conversation in this forum. So the story I ended up writing actually had a slightly different genesis, because I was in the midst of this trying to keep up with what was going on with pandemic effects on the Utah tech sector. Obviously, we had this big shift from in-person employment to everybody working from their various remote locations. And in my conversations with founders and HR people, I was hearing details about how remote work was going, but I was also hearing these inklings of kind of a positive lining, if you will, of the conditions. And these companies were saying, hey, we think this is an opportunity to make big steps toward, or some steps toward, better steps toward reaching our diversity goals, because remote work was allowing them to recruit among some different groups that were more difficult to get on board. And I heard HR people talking about how they were bringing moms and dads with home childcare job responsibilities were able to now engage in these other employment opportunities, people with mobility issues, other people who are caring for elderly family members, et cetera. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. I want to chase that. But in the pursuit of learning more about that, I came across some more profound data and information and commentary, which was looking at how unevenly the impacts of the pandemic were falling down on the bigger workforce. And even though we have across the country have an essentially split by gender workforce, women employees were getting hit much harder than their male counterparts. And then, of course, I came across Dr. Glynn's work and others who explored all of these contributing factors to what was driving these changes.
Thanks, Art. It sounds like the pandemic has hurt women, but there's also an opportunity for improvement here. Savannah, can you tell us about your piece, A New Normal Should Treat Women Better Than the Pandemic Did? Tell us why you said feminism did not fail women, but society failed families.
So, in the last year, working moms and stay-at-home moms have been really crushed under this burden of maintaining family morale, adapting to virtual schooling, handling increased chore load, and they're somehow still supposed to take care of themselves. So, to me, this mass exodus of women from the workforce was not indicative of feminism failing. It was a symptom of America's failure to give parents, especially mothers, support that they needed. It's not women's or mothers' fault that the system failed them. Disaster struck, and our only backup system was moms. They stepped up to the plate and helped everyone by trying to maintain a sense of morale and normal, but nobody has come to help them. Taking care of moms benefits everyone. I learned in my piece that early reports have shown survival rates of infants has increased in last year and premature births have gone down. That's most likely due to women being able to stay home and off their feet during the final trimester of pregnancy, which is something that was very helpful to me in the last year. Normally, my commute was about an hour long, but being able to stay home and rest during those final weeks was very helpful. And COVID has laid bare the truth that many of us already knew: motherhood is a full-time job. It's not a luxury. It's easy to look at this as women leaving the workforce, but I like to view it as women leaving a paid job for an unpaid job. And we can't really go back to normal because normal is what caused this crisis in the first place. So a future that we should work toward is one that values mothers, and it will be stronger. It'll be more resilient so that when disaster strikes again, that foundation we fall on is able to support an entire society.
Thanks, Savannah. So I want to dive deeper in sort of unpacking these problems and their root causes. And then later in the conversation, we're going to pivot to solutions. So Reshma, thanks so much for joining us. And because of the pandemic, not only are more women being laid off than men, more women are making the decision to leave the workforce. And on top of that, now we're seeing women are lagging behind men at reentering the workforce. So I want to know what you learned from your own experience as a working mom about what all moms in this country are going through.
Look, I mean, I think that women and moms are simply getting crushed. When I started the pandemic, I had just had a baby via surrogate. So I had a 1 week old and a 5 month old. And I was running one of the largest women and girls organizations in the world that was also getting crushed in a global pandemic. And so I woke up every day at 5:30 and ended my day just exhausted. And in between Zoom meetings, in between trying to raise millions of dollars, I was making puree and changing diapers and just barely trying to survive. And I think, like a lot of mothers in the beginning, we kind of grinned and bared it. And I think now we've reached kind of our breaking point. And for me, my breaking point was when the schools didn't open, or I found myself now having to log my son on at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, and 11 o'clock. And the thing that really upset me was that nobody asked me. I think that we had this 1950s sensibility that we could just, close the schools or, have them be unstable, and that somebody at home would do that. And that somebody was us, because we already knew that 75% of the unpaid labor is being done by women. And so we never really had a choice. And, we didn't leave the workforce, we were pushed out. And, we were pushed out, I think, just incredibly painfully, because many women I know had to go on food stamps, move in with their parents, take up the third shift. And so I think, as you mentioned, Savannah, we have always treated America's mothers as our social safety net. And I think we're done. And, our message to moms with the Marshall Plan for Moms is like, we don't work for free, and that our labor must be valued, and nothing will change. And so we've really advocated for a 360 plan. I hate this term, but I'm going to say it, like, never waste a good crisis. And I think that we have an opportunity to kind of build America back better and build motherhood back better. And that means, short-term monthly payments for moms. It means finally passing paid leave and affordable daycare. It means getting rid of the motherhood penalty and, retraining so many moms who were in jobs that weren't pandemic proof. So again, I think that we have an enormous opportunity here that we should not waste, because the fact that we lost 30 years of economic progress for women in 9 months should scare the heck out of us.
Thanks, Reshma. Yeah, I think whether you're a mom or you know moms, you've seen just how difficult this has been to juggle the homeschooling and the work and the parenting and, just kind of the emotional effects of this crisis at the same time. Susan, I want to turn to you. Thanks so much for being here. So there's research to suggest that one of the reasons women are losing their jobs is because they're at the top of these kind of human resource firing lists, meaning that when there are layoffs, women are the first to go. And we also know that white women have been largely insulated from these losses, and it's women of color who make up the majority of the statistics. So from your perspective and from a corporate standpoint, why is that the case?
I have to say that white women have also been seriously affected, but we do see a disproportionate number, especially in certain industries, of women of color. But white women have also really seen an impact as well. In fact, one of the studies that I think early on in the pandemic that was so fascinating was really a study from Qualtrics that looked at the promotions. So if women are in that middle to upper level, actually the promotions during the pandemic have been going more towards men and not necessarily women, because the impact of homeschooling, the impact of just not being able to do all that unpaid care work, and as well, trying to do childcare and housework and unpaid care work in general. What we know across the world and in the United States, and particularly here in Utah, that we have our women just do more unpaid care work. So when they do work at home, as white women, maybe more professional women in leadership roles, that they really are not moving towards those promotions. They're cutting back some hours so that they can really manage everything. And by the way, it really matters where you're at in terms of your children, how old your children are, what part of life you're in. But we do know that motherhood penalty is very, very real. And by the way, in the state of Utah, I have 3 research teams right now analyzing data. We collected extensive data, 3,600 responses, including like over 2,200 qualitative responses on the impact of COVID-19 on women at work. So the research that we're doing will be one of the, I think, biggest studies in the whole United States. And we've measured health, mental health. We don't talk about that a lot, but mental health. We measure burnout. We measure perceptions of what organizations have done, how they've supported, how they've not. We're measuring what industry they're in, just even basic levels with race and everything. So we've got some really great research coming out. And we do know there's different impacts depending on industries. Art was talking about the tech industry that hasn't been hit as hard. And then in terms of economic level, we're already seeing some interesting data coming in. We'll see if it plays out, that we compared household incomes from 2019 to 2020. And we're seeing definitely the folks that are earning less in terms, or have less in terms of household incomes, you see a drop. And the ones that are doing more, you see an increase actually. So I think that's interesting to look at.
I'm so glad you're doing that research, because I think it all starts with understanding what's actually going on. And you mentioned the industries. I mean, is it that women have different kinds of jobs than men? And is it these jobs in hospitality, the food industry, that are most affected by the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially in the first, you saw it depending on what state you're in, right? As soon as things shut down, women lost a lot of those jobs. And when you look at race, when you put race and ethnicity in it, you do see in most states that women of color are in more of those service industries, more of those the restaurant and some care, and those were totally shut down. And so that was disproportionate. But when you look at tech industries and things that transition really easily to home work, like higher education, I'm a professor, easy to work at home, right? You can do classes over Zoom and different things. So a lot of us have not been affected, other than we get bored being at home, right? And especially, I'm older. My kids are out of the house now, so I'm impacted much differently. So it's very different depending on the industry, your age of children, and so forth. But I would say everybody has been impacted in some way.
That's right. I mean, all of us here are able to do this via Zoom. You can't necessarily do certain jobs that way. Sarah Jane, we're so happy to have you as well. Can you share with us some of your research on the root causes of employment inequality that we've been talking about, and what are the potential downstream impacts of this phenomenon on families?
Yeah, so I think, everybody has brought up such great points already. And one of the things that I think is underlaying everyone's comments so far is that none of this is actually new, right? We want to imagine maybe that like COVID-19 showed up and it caused all of these new problems, but that's not actually what happened, right? All of these cracks that were already there have widened. So the pandemic has made a bad situation for women and for mothers significantly worse, but it hasn't necessarily created problems that weren't already there. We already had a childcare crisis. We were already the only advanced country in the world that doesn't offer paid maternity leave. We already had no guarantee nationally for paid sick days before the pandemic started. So all of these problems were there. They've been there for decades, and we just haven't done anything about them. And so, hopefully one potential possible silver lining is that we can wake up and realize the economy doesn't work without women. The economy certainly doesn't work without mothers, and we have to change something and fix this, because otherwise we are looking at a really, really bad future if we don't help these women get back to work. So part of it is a really immediate concern, right? If women have lost their jobs, we know women have lost the majority of jobs as a result of the recession. And we know that, so we've got about 5.3 million net jobs lost to women. Another 2.3 million women have left the labor force entirely, often because of these caregiving challenges that they're experiencing at home. So that means there's an immediate hit to family economic security. And that's a problem because women aren't just working for fun. I think, some people imagine this idea of the male breadwinner and mom who maybe has a part-time job, making, pocket money. And in some families that's true, but not for the majority, right? So we know that before the pandemic started, more than 41% of mothers were breadwinners for their families. So they were earning all or most of the income that their family had. When those women lose their jobs, or if those women have to quit working, that's a serious economic hit in the short term. But there's also really negative long-term consequences. So right now, we have a really growing field of long-term unemployed people who've been out of work for 6 or more months. And we know from past recessions, when that happens, it has a negative impact on future earnings. So if you're out of work for a long time, which is likely to be the case for these women who have these extreme caregiving challenges at home, right? We don't know when school's going to be 100% back in person, or when daycares are going to reopen. So if you're out of work for a really long time, it's hard to find another job. It's especially hard if there's also tons of other unemployed people like we're experiencing right now. And you're going to have a wage penalty when you do find work. So that's going to follow you potentially for the rest of your career. And then you layer that on top of the motherhood wage penalty and the gender wage gap that are already there that artificially decrease wages for women. And you end up with a really depressing picture where women's wages that were already too low are going to likely be even lower moving into the future. And so that has impacts for their families, but that has impacts for economic growth overall. And it really can harm families when it comes to retirement security. So we're going to be feeling the impacts of this 20, 30, 40 years from now if we don't get things right now. And so that's why it's really important for us to be making investments and to really be centering women and women with caregiving responsibilities in particular in the recovery, because we know that if we help moms, we help everybody. And so it's not about doing something that's just for moms. It's about recognizing that when you help mothers, you actually lift everybody up at the same time.
Thanks so much for laying out some of those statistics, because they are really striking. And, you realize it's not just, affecting a woman if she loses her jobs, but, a generation, if she's supporting her family. And I want to stop you right there and ask if you can kind of address this question of the gender pay gap very quickly. I think there's a lot of confusion about what exactly it's measuring, what exactly it is, and a lot of misconceptions that arise from that confusion. Can you just quickly define what that is when you're talking about it?
Sure. So, there's a lot of different statistics that are out there, and I don't want to get bogged down on the actual numbers because depending on data source, it can look a little bit different. But the overall gist is that when you compare women and men, they don't earn the same amount on average, right? And that's true whether you're looking at all women and all men, or even when you're looking within occupations, there are still wage gaps that occur looking at people who perform the exact same kinds of jobs. And I think sometimes people will say, oh, well, there are gender differences in the workforce, right? Women tend to have different types of jobs. They tend to work different hours. They tend to have different levels of education. Women actually have more education on average than men. But those differences are what cause these differentials in pay. And that's actually not totally the case, right? So if you really dig into it, there is occupational segregation. Men and women tend to have different types of jobs. But it's not that the jobs that men do are more valuable or more worthwhile. It's just that as a society, we've decided to pay those jobs more. So I would argue being a preschool teacher is actually an incredibly valuable job, right? You're literally helping take care of the next generation. But because that's a job that's primarily done by women and that's highly feminized, we value it less and we pay those people less. Women work slightly fewer hours than men, but if you factor in all of that unpaid labor that happens at home, mothers work significantly more hours every day than fathers do. And women get funneled into particular tracks when they go to work too, right? So the fact that we don't have universal paid leave, for example, means that you can end up being mommy tracked, and then you're not up for those same promotions, and people aren't necessarily giving you the same opportunities because they assume that as a mother you wouldn't necessarily want them, or because if you're the person who's responsible for primary care for your child, it can be really difficult to make it to that happy hour where the networking happens, or to work that extra overtime to show to your boss that you're committed. So it's not necessarily always about the choices that men and women make. It's that we push men and women in different directions and we value their contributions differently. So that's a short version of explaining why we see these differentials in pay.
Susan, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, one thing, Sarah did such a great job with that topic. I talk about that quite often, and it's so complex. But oftentimes they do say, well, it's part of this is women's choice, or it's this or that. But I will just mention one thing that Sarah didn't mention, and that really is a lot of times women get blamed because they don't negotiate. So they don't have more. And the assumption is that everything has been equal for men and women from the start. But what we know is girls and boys are socialized so much different. And so we don't ask often. And some of that we can say, well, we can try and develop women themselves. But on the other hand, when women do ask, we're breaking social norms, not just to men, but women leaders as well. They're like, oh, it feels funny when a woman is asking for a raise. I wonder what that is, or she's selfish, or different things. So it's really complex, even when you say, well, isn't that a woman's choice? So when you get down to it, in Utah, we're still at 70 cents to the dollar. And you can take out occupational segregation and different things. But as Sarah said, when you get right down to it, you can take some of those, pennies away. There is still a good chunk that is really discrimination, unconscious bias, conscious bias, discrimination.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think it's important to note that it's not just, looking at a micro level, men and women pay different for the same job, but this macro level of why people are making certain decisions and why they have certain jobs and certain opportunities. And I want to give Art and Savannah each an opportunity to weigh in on what they see as the factors driving this disparity. Is this culture or is this economics? And starting with Savannah, if you don't mind.
I think the part I'd like to address is the culture aspect. And we've kind of touched on it a little bit on that mental load that mothers often adopt. And the way I've described that to people is if you look at my calendar versus my husband's calendar, mine always has the doctor's appointments for the baby or the little things that we admin things that we need to take care of, or those things that aren't really crossing his mind as often. He can compartmentalize a little bit more that work is for work and home is home, and keep those separate. But our culture is more that mothers adopt all of that. We assume that entire role. And Art touches on this in his story a bit too, but even when we're at home, mothers are still adopting that role if both spouses are at home. If something goes wrong, it's going to be the mom who steps in to fix it. And that is a cultural level thing that we need to start to address as we raise our children, as we talk about this, that we can pay more and we can address these other disparities, but we have to work on the cultural level of equaling things out, of dispersing the chores and dispersing things, how it best works within our own families. I don't think it's safe to assume that there's a solution for everybody that works for everyone. We have to talk within our own family units and see what works. And that's part of this is embracing flexibility, letting parents raise their children the way they see fit, and really diving down and talking about, like, why is it so much harder for me to balance work and raising a child sometimes? Why doesn't it seem to affect our husbands as much? And so we really got to dive down and talk about that and figure out ways that we can equal things out and not put all that pressure and expectations on mothers to behave a certain way. We talk about mom guilt a lot as well, and that's something that definitely needs to be addressed. That's a culture thing, is that moms making different choices isn't always bad, and there are different ways to raise children, and we can't judge a mom who chooses to work or a mom who chooses to stay home. As we've talked about, those are both jobs and both fulfilling jobs. So there are a lot of cultural things, I think, that are magnified when we bring it onto that work level. We look at things, these big numbers, and it starts there. It starts on that level at home.
I think, to Susan's point, both Savannah and I have young kids, and so we're really living this reality in an interesting way, I think, right now. And I think part of it is because I think both of us probably stare at our husbands like, really? Because I think the reality is, in COVID, you can't say that work is unseen anymore. They've very much seen us do the laundry and order the groceries and do all that while we're working full time. So there has to be a behavioral change. I'm really proud that we launched 50 Men for the Marshall Plan today, from Steph Curry to Don Cheadle to Colin Farrell to Alexis Ohanian to leaders in every single sector who are saying, you know what, it's on us. Because the other thing that I don't want to be added to my plate is it's my job to fix my husband, or it's my job to fix the men, in our society, or that somehow I am at fault. You know what I mean? That I have all of this unpaid, unseen labor. And, part of what I do think it's important, the conversation around payments is really important, is I think part of the reason why they don't step up is because they know it has no value, they know it has no respect. I mean, unpaid labor is not even in our GDP. And I wonder, right, if we actually put a value to it, we started sending mothers checks for this work, whether that might be the thing for men to say, oh, all right, me too. I find it ironic that in our country that we're so excited about UBI, paying people for not working, but the idea of paying mothers for working is radical. It's interesting.
Right. Okay, thanks. This is perfect because I want to pivot to solutions here. Art, I hope you don't mind if we skip over you for now. We'll come back. But, I love also, Savannah, that you brought up flexibility because, the division of labor in your home is a very personal, choice, a very personal decision that you have to make. And so it's not necessarily prescribing that there needs to be an exactly equal split between men and women in a household, but rather kind of providing the opportunities for flexibility so that families can choose the arrangement that works best for them. And Reshma, you have proposed a really bold solution for closing the gap that does exist that involves, like you mentioned, a short-term monthly payment to mothers of $2,400 a month, among other policy changes. And what I want to know is, does paying women for their domestic labor reinforce the idea that childcare and housework are women's jobs? And how is this plan different than simply raising stimulus check amounts for families?
Yeah, I think absolutely not. Because I think what we're talking about is what's happened in COVID to mothers. There was just a stat that came out today that I wanted to read that I think was important was that, actually women without children added 700,000 jobs. So the penalty that is happening is caretaking for kids, and so the burden of this pandemic is falling on mothers. And, that doesn't take away from anybody else. But I think it is important when we think about solutions to focus on, to have focus and not exclude. And I think to have focus on motherhood and why are mothers suffering such a brunt is an important conversation to have. So I think the importance of short-term monthly payments to moms in this moment is critical because moms need cash in their pockets, to pay for food or to pay for childcare or to do what they think is fit for their family. And I think the other point is important we didn't choose to leave the workforce. We were pushed out. And, every mother I know wants to work. She has dreams and aspirations that she's had to put on the side because she's had to homeschool. And so I think recognizing that is really important. I also think, and Sarah Jane talked about this so much. I'm like such a fangirl of you, right? Like, everything you've said is just so powerful. But we have an opportunity to do this over again and to not have this economic recession last 30 years. So I think we have to think boldly. I think we have to put all ideas on the table. And even ideas that we think are radical or that won't lead to gender equity. And that includes, I think, payments for mothers, in this moment. And I think what's fascinating is we are actually paying parents. It's being called the childcare tax credit. And so that idea that seems so radical is actually being, hopefully passed through Congress, which is exciting and I think important and forward thinking.
And you took out a full-page ad in the New York Times addressed to the Biden administration that was signed by a lot of high-profile women, celebrities. Have you heard back from the president yet?
Look, I mean, I think that we are in constant conversation with the White House. I was so excited to see Kamala Harris, pin an op-ed about this very important topic. And to really address women. So I think it's made a huge difference. I think it's ignited a movement. And I think it's uplifted so many voices like, Sarah Jane and Susan and economists who've been talking about this, organizations like the National Domestic Workers Alliance have been talking about restructuring childcare, organizations like Paid Leave for All. So people have been doing this work. They have been talking about how childcare is broken in this country for a very long time. My goal is to tap into the populist rage that so many mothers are feeling right now and be like, let's go march for paid leave. Let's go march for affordable daycare. Let's go call every single congressman and demand, that these policies, are actually once and for all passed. So, and ask for even more, I want every company to know that we're watching you. We're watching whether you're going to build the workplace back better for us. We're watching whether you're going to provide flexibility. We are watching whether you are going to get rid of the motherhood penalty once and for all. I think they're terrified of us. And I think I'm excited about that. And so we're going to keep, putting fire, on this and keep igniting that populist rage that many mothers feel right now.
Yeah, so you mentioned the tax credits. We talked about stimulus checks that are going to families. It seems like you're saying this is just about asking for even more than that they're already getting. I want to know, since mothers are not the only caretakers in our society, is, addressing this to mothers, what's the significance of that? Is it symbolic, or do you think it's realistic that we can really pinpoint and define mothers when there are different types of caretakers today?
Look, I think what benefits mothers benefits everybody. It's focus, not exclusion, right? You fix the childcare system, it affects single dads. It benefits, caregivers that are caring for our parents. I mean, look, I think every mother probably like me has spent countless hours trying to sign up our parents for the COVID vaccine, right? Like that's mothering too. Like many of us, I mean, I'm 45, I have 2 young children and I have 2 80-year-old parents. So I might as well as have 4 kids right now. And I think many of us, are feeling that way. And so all of these policies, all of this recognition of our work and our labor is going to benefit all caregivers. But I do think I'm the CEO of Girls Who Code. And when I started Girls Who Code, people said to me, well, why not all kids? Shouldn't all kids learn how to code? Yes. But the reality is less than 20% of our technology workforce is women, and that we have been pushing women out. So to focus on girls 10 years later not only benefited girls, but benefited boys. And I actually think the same is true right now by constantly calling attention to what mothers are facing right now. That's going to benefit all caregivers.
Susan, I'd love to hear you comment on what you think of the Marshall Plan for Moms. Also, maybe how it compares to policies that we see in other countries that maybe are achieving higher levels of equality.
So I want to come back to just a couple of points that relate to an earlier conversation, then happy to dive in that. But one thing that was really missed is in two different studies, there's research that says that more men actually think they're doing equal work. So first of all, we know that many men have stepped forward, but there's more on the plate. And there's this perception, again, that men think they're doing equal work with their spouses or partners. And so there's this whole element of education and awareness, this invisible work that women do that looks so flawless to so many people, kind of drives us crazy in some ways. And another study actually said, in terms of men, that if there's two partners or, a woman and a man working in the home, that actually women do pick up more of the tasks, but men are feeling more stress. Now think about that for a minute. So what it comes down to is women, we are used to multitasking. We've had to. We don't have this luxury to compartmentalize our lives. We have an integrated life. I did a lot of work-life research for many, many years. And so we're just used to being able to do that. And when men are asked to do that, it's causing this uncomfortable stress that I'm not used to having to do that. So those elements, I think, are really important to have in the conversation on educating, on helping, raise awareness for women and men about some of those dynamics, and bringing up the importance of conversations on different kind of roles and tasks and duties that we've just been giving to women for generations. So sorry, Erica, I took a long time on that, but I think that information is just so important for us to have out there. And then your other question was about policies. We do know, years ago, I started teaching for the University of Minnesota, the work-family relationships class. I was the only doctoral student they knew with 4 young children at the time. Yes, I did 4 young children. I have grandchildren now. But the US is quite far behind. Really, all the developed countries, and I should say a few developing countries. But we are a different society, and we're changing. And so, we do look at being different than some of these, especially European countries. Yet, when we look at moving forward, we have to be more like these other countries if we really want men and women working together, which we need for our economy, which we need for our individual homes. We assume, all of you probably know the TED talk, it's a single story, the danger of the single story. For generations, we've had that. We think all families are a certain way and women don't really need to work, but that's just not the case anymore. So we need, in terms of childcare, leave policies, so many things that the rest of you are working on. We need to take that seriously. Maybe it doesn't work exactly like it does in other countries, but we can shift and change and make those things work here.
Sarah Jane, so far we've been talking about, this case where a woman wants to work and is not able to because she's being pushed out of the workforce. I mean, to what extent are we living in an economy where it is no longer possible to support a family on a single income? And how often are we seeing both parents forced to work in a situation where maybe one would prefer to be a full-time caregiver to children?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I'm actually really glad that you brought this up, because I think sometimes we can end up having a conversation that's all about the women who've been pushed out of work and who have scaled back and are staying home. it's not always the case, but that's often a pretty privileged position to be in, because that means that you have some other income coming in that's going to continue to feed your family, right? And so for folks who are working class, for people who are in low wage jobs, for solo parents who don't have another partner who's contributing income, that isn't necessarily an option, right? So there's another group of women here that we also really need to be focused on. Maybe they're essential workers, maybe they're just in low wage jobs. But they have to figure out a way to make all of this work at the same time. They don't get to stay home. They don't get to work remotely. And so their kids still aren't going to school. Their kids still aren't going to daycare, but they have to keep reporting to work. And so what are those mothers doing? What are those families doing? What kind of situations are they finding themselves in where maybe they're having to do things that aren't necessarily the best fit for them or their families, or that don't feel safe, either from like a COVID and a public health standpoint, or just, having to leave kids home alone. If you talk to any middle or high school teacher right now, they will tell you it's largely their girl students who are having to miss out on doing their own high school or middle school classes because they're caring for their younger siblings because their parents had to go to work, right? So there's a lot of different levels of how this is playing out and harming families, but we know that it's pretty rare now to have this traditional, to be clear, like this was never actually the reality for most families, right? But we have this kind of Leave It to Beaver, Mad Men story of like a white man, right, who was earning a lot of money, who was taking care of his family, and his wife was able to stay home and raise his kids. For families of color, for low-wage families, that was never really the reality. But that just isn't what our lives look like anymore. Wages have stagnated for men as well. Most families need two incomes in order to get by. Like I said, you've got 4 in 10 moms who are breadwinners for their families. Many of those women are married. They just earn as much or more than their husbands. So this idea that you have the luxury of being able to choose to stay home, that's not an option for a lot of people. Some people figure out a way to make it work, but within their financial constraints. You've got to be doing pretty well economically to be able to make that choice to have one of the parents stay home full time. And I think it looks like Savannah was trying to jump in. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of piggyback off of that a little bit. And that is a criticism that I've received in the past for things that I write, is that, well, if you can't afford to have children or have somebody stay at home, don't have them. And that's very problematic because that makes having a family quite elitist and something that only the extremely wealthy could afford. And even in that scenario, there's problems, because then we're forcing the caretaking on underpaid or unpaid domestic laborers. And that's a whole other issue. This is not about making enough money. This is about supporting all families, that we have equal opportunity. And there's further evidence that we need to change things. I mean, among wealthy nations, we have the highest rate of child poverty. And that's indicative that there is an issue as well, and that we need to step up and support families. Many of the existing policies that we do have are outdated in the sense that they focused on supporting aging populations, and the population now is aging out. And we need to reevaluate, start from scratch, and say, wait, there's a reason the birth rate is falling. There's a reason that there's so much anecdotal evidence that women are choosing not to have children after this year, which is something that I also recently wrote about, and the fact that we're going through now a baby bust due to the pandemic. We need to look at that and say, wait, our social policies are kind of not suiting this large population, the majority of the population, that it needs to be. And we're hurting children, we're hurting the future generations as we do this. So we need to reevaluate and look at that. And because if we don't offer that same opportunity and flexibility to everybody, then we are denying future opportunities and risking the health of our children and future generations.
Thanks, Savannah. Yeah, I think this whole conversation kind of highlights why, that support system is so necessary. So in terms of solutions, we've talked about childcare support, paid family leave. We've talked about economic supports. In your article, you talked about remote working or telecommuting as one of the solutions that provides more flexibility for families. Do you think remote work is here to stay? And are there drawbacks to that kind of arrangement?
Well, certainly I think we know, or we have a sense that remote work is here to stay in a bigger presence than it had pre-pandemic. But I'm also, in kind of going back to the seeds that led me to this coverage of, can remote work be a tool to achieve diversity goals? One of the people I talked to for this story, Sydney Tetro, is a co-founder of a group called Women Tech Council in Utah, has walked me through data on several occasions that reflects, the more you make your workplace look like the world we live in, that it has direct, quantifiable bottom line benefits. So I'm wondering, with maybe a new tool in the toolkit of remote work that maybe allows companies to draw in a better demographic, a demographic that looks more like the world we live in. On the private sector side, they help drive change that public policy struggles with. Rashma's feeding this, diversifying the sort of entry level to this talent pipeline. We know recruitment drives the tech industry so powerfully that if you just incentivize that by, here's where the talent is. These companies will chase talent regardless. That's, it drives the innovation industries. I can see where it's sort of an optimistic take that private industry may be able to play a role sort of on the other side of the chasm from public policymakers to push this reality to diversify the workforce, to create more opportunity. And part of that certainly would be creating work opportunities that suit primary caregivers. That just becomes part of the playing field and not an added benefit, or if you happen to be German, you get 6 months of paid leave or whatever, that it becomes more part of our reality and perhaps driven by pure business interest.
Thanks. The time has gone so quickly. I want to end by circling back to Reshma, Susan, and Sarah Jane in that order, and just give you 30 seconds to maybe sum up your thoughts or get to something that we haven't gotten to yet.
Look, I think that we have a huge opportunity here. And I think this crisis has uncovered what was already broken. But I'm going to say this 1,000 times, we can't build America back better unless we build motherhood back better. And so we can tap into this populist mom rage and finally pass policies like affordable daycare and paid leave, and think innovatively about what we're going to do in Main Street and Wall Street to make sure that mothers are supported, whether it's by flexibility, whether it's by retraining. And I think we have to continue to be open-minded towards, offering mothers short-term monthly payments, to help them in this moment. And again, none of this is going to happen if we don't figure out how to open up schools safely. I'll already tell you, as a mom, I am freaking out that I don't feel like schools are going to open in the fall. And if that does happen, if schools do not open 5 days a week in the fall, forget about 1989 labor market participations. We're going to be back into the 1960s.
Me?
Yeah, go ahead. Thanks.
Great.
Thanks, Reshma.
Thank you. The one thing I really support what Art said is there's so many things that companies and even government agencies and everyone, there's so many flexible and family-friendly policies that we can implement that are not necessarily social, through the legislature and different things. Things like, of course, remote work. We did a big study a couple months ago and published it on this. But paid maternity leave, part-time roles, shifting, being more fluid with work hours, unpaid family medical leave, even tuition reimbursement can be linked to COVID, and transitions back to work, unlimited PTO, compressed work week. There's just a whole list of things. But what we know is this, that there are things that have been shown in the research and best practices to work for organizations. And some of those emerge into our public policy as well. But when companies sometimes say, we don't know how to handle this, there are already good strategies. There are things that work. We just need to look around.
Thanks so much. And take us home, Sarah Jane.
Yeah, I think I would just echo a lot of what's already been said. The COVID-19 recession looks different than prior recessions, and that means that we need a different response to get out of it. And because the impacts have been so disproportionately felt by women and by people of color, we have to center equity in the recovery process. It's the only way that we're actually going to experience a quick recovery, and the economic growth that we can have is if we center people of color, if we center workers of color, and if we center caregivers. Those are the folks who've been hit the hardest. Those are an incredibly important sector of our economy, and we have to make sure that those workers have the protections and the supports that they need if we're going to come back better. And this isn't just about doing something that's really nice for individuals. To be clear, like, I care a lot about helping people and how they're doing, and like, I want everyone to be happy and feel good in their lives. That in and of itself is a really valuable goal, to make people's lives just easier and better. But there's also a really strong business case for all of this. If we can center caregivers and if we can center the most marginalized people, we will have a stronger, better economy, and it will benefit businesses just as much as it benefits those individual workers. There is actually a potential outcome where everybody wins, but we have to go big. If we think of anything, and if we learn anything from the past, it's that the mistake is never going too big. The mistake is always going too small.
Well, thank you all for your insightful comments. I think this was a really valuable discussion, and I look forward to seeing what changes are to come for women and families. And for all of you listening, thank you so much for joining our Deseret News panel today. We hope it will spark new ideas and conversations for you, and we will continue to follow these issues, so please look for our coverage on Deseret.com.